The hospital room was as silent as a graveyard. Machines blinked softly, a faint rhythm of beeps filling the air. Behind the glass wall, the CEO of Aldridge Enterprises, Victor Aldridge himself, stood trembling. His daughter, Eleanor, once a vibrant young woman with a voice that had carried warmth and laughter into every space she entered, now sat in a wheelchair staring at nothing. A terrible accident had stolen her words. Doctors had tried everything: speech therapy, advanced neurological procedures, even experimental treatments, but nothing had worked. Her silence had become a shadow that followed her everywhere. Victor was a man accustomed to control, to bending reality with wealth and power. Yet here he stood, broken. "If you teach her to speak again, I'll give you everything," he cried out, his voice cracking with desperation. He wasn't speaking to the team of specialists in crisp white coats. They had already shaken their heads and spoken of limits and impossibilities. His plea wasn't directed at them. The words were meant for the quiet figure at the back of the room, the janitor, Thomas. He was an older man, hair streaked with silver, hands calloused from years of scrubbing floors and polishing the endless glass walls of Aldridge Enterprises' skyscraper. For years, he had moved about unnoticed, his presence blending into the background like a piece of furniture. But when Eleanor had been wheeled into the rehabilitation ward, Thomas had been there, watching her with eyes that seemed to hold secrets of a world few could imagine. At first, the staff dismissed him. What could a janitor know about something that had baffled neurologists and speech pathologists? But Victor's plea had cracked open the silence, and Thomas, after a long pause, stepped forward. He didn't make promises. He didn't ask for money. He simply said in a low, calm voice, "I can try." Eleanor's gaze flicked to him then, for the first time in months showing a glimmer of recognition. It wasn't dramatic, just a spark, like the faint glow of a candle in the dark. Thomas approached her slowly, carrying no medical instruments, no tablets, no wires, only a small wooden flute tucked into his pocket and a notebook filled with sketches and symbols. While the doctors scoffed, Thomas knelt beside Eleanor and whispered something no one else could hear. Her lips trembled as if her body remembered what her mind had forgotten. Victor, leaning against the wall, felt his heart pound harder than it ever had in a boardroom war. For the first time since the accident, hope seeped into the room like sunlight through a cracked door. Thomas visited Eleanor every day after his shift, never wearing the white coat of authority, only his faded uniform and the smell of cleaning soap clinging to his hands. The staff mocked quietly, whispering behind clipboards, but he didn't care. He sat across from her, setting the wooden flute gently on the table between them as if it were an offering. The first time he played, the sound was haunting, thin, breathy notes that curled through the sterile air of the ward like smoke from another world. Eleanor's eyes, once empty, began to follow the melody. He would stop mid-tune and coax her to hum along, not with words, but with the raw vibration of sound. At first, nothing came. Days passed. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, her throat strained, and the faintest sound escaped, raspy, broken, but undeniably hers. The nurses gasped, Victor dropped his phone, and Thomas only nodded as though he had expected it all along. But this wasn't just about teaching speech again. Thomas wasn't guiding her with phonetics or syllables, he was unlocking something deeper, as though he understood the hidden currents of the human spirit. He drew strange patterns in his notebook, spirals and shapes that seemed meaningless to others. He whispered phrases in languages no one recognized, yet Eleanor responded. It was as if he was reaching beyond the brain, touching something in her soul. Victor grew restless, hovering around each session, desperate for results. "Money, equipment, anything, just tell me what you need," he pressed. But Thomas refused everything. "All she needs," he said, "is patience, and someone who believes she can." On the 37th day, Eleanor's lips parted as Thomas hummed a tune. The room stilled. A fragile voice, trembling like a newborn bird's wings, carried a single word, "Father." The sound shattered the silence, echoing against the cold hospital walls. Victor staggered forward, tears flooding his eyes. For months he had prayed to hear that voice again, and here it was, soft, broken, but alive. Eleanor reached out her hand, and Victor clasped it, sobbing uncontrollably. The doctors were speechless, unable to explain what they had just witnessed. But Thomas only rose quietly, wiping his hands on his uniform. For him, it wasn't a miracle. It was simply remembering something the world had forgotten, that healing did not always come from machines or medicine but from the hidden music within. Eleanor's first word spread through the hospital like wildfire. Staff who had given up hope suddenly crowded the hallways, craning their necks to glimpse the girl who had defied silence. Reporters began to circle outside, hungry for a headline about the billionaire's daughter and her miraculous recovery. Victor, though overjoyed, couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that whatever Thomas was doing reached far deeper than simply coaxing speech. Each day, Thomas returned, calm as ever, his presence a steady anchor against the chaos. He never raised his voice, never rushed. Sometimes he didn't even play the flute. He would simply sit across from Eleanor and draw symbols in his notebook, slowly showing them to her one by one. Spirals, arcs, and strange geometrical figures filled the pages. At first she stared blankly, but then she began to trace them in the air with her fingers, her lips moving faintly as though testing sounds she had long forgotten. "Why these shapes?" Victor finally asked one evening, unable to contain his curiosity. "Are they words? Letters? Some kind of therapy technique?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He finished sketching another spiral, then turned the notebook toward Victor. "They are keys," he said. "Not to the mind, but to memory. The body remembers sound even when the brain does not. These patterns awaken that memory." Victor frowned, but Eleanor smiled faintly, as though she understood more than her father did. The next time Thomas played the flute, she hummed again, louder this time. 2 words escaped her lips: "Thank you." The nurses cried. Victor nearly collapsed to his knees. But as Eleanor's voice grew stronger, something else began to stir. The more she practiced, the more her speech returned not in fragments but in full sentences she should not have known. She spoke in strange tongues, words that belonged to no modern language, flowing from her lips with ease. The doctors recorded everything, baffled, their scientific explanations faltering in the face of the impossible. One night, when the ward was nearly empty, Victor confronted Thomas again. "Who are you, really? A janitor doesn't do this. You've given me back my daughter, and I'm grateful beyond words, but I need to know." Thomas looked up from polishing the floor, his eyes reflecting something ancient, something unyielding. "I was never here to clean your floors," he said softly. "I was here to clean her silence." Victor shivered. For the first time in his life, surrounded by all the power money could buy, he realized he was standing before a man who operated outside the reach of wealth, science, or reason. Eleanor's recovery accelerated in ways no one could have predicted. Within weeks, she spoke fluently again, her voice growing steadier, her laughter returning like music long forgotten. But with each passing day, the strange words slipped more frequently into her sentences, like a hidden undercurrent. Sometimes in the middle of a conversation with Victor, her tone would shift, her eyes glazing as she spoke in languages that seemed older than history itself. Victor grew uneasy, torn between elation and fear. "She's healed," he told himself over and over, "that's all that matters." Yet at night, when Eleanor whispered words in her sleep that made the air hum and the lights flicker, he knew this was no ordinary recovery. Thomas never appeared unsettled. He listened carefully, nodding when Eleanor spoke in the unknown tongues, occasionally jotting down phrases into his notebook. "She remembers," he murmured once when Victor pressed him. "She is pulling back the voices buried inside her." "Voices?" Victor asked sharply. "You make it sound as if she's possessed." Thomas shook his head. "Not possessed. Awakened. Every soul carries echoes. Most never hear them. But when the silence broke in her, the echoes came rushing back." Victor didn't know what to believe, but the evidence was undeniable. One evening, Eleanor sat at the window, staring at the city lights below, and spoke softly, "The tower will fall if the stone is not replaced." Victor froze. "What tower? What stone?" She blinked, as though waking from a trance, and said nothing more. Days later, the Aldridge Enterprises boardroom buzzed with panic. Engineers had discovered a structural fault in one of the company's skyscrapers. A cornerstone block in the foundation had cracked, threatening collapse. If not repaired, the building could crumble within months. Victor remembered Eleanor's words and felt the blood drain from his face. He found Thomas in the hospital corridor and grabbed him by the arm. How could she know this? She's never been near the construction sites, never seen the reports. Tell me what's happening. Thomas met his gaze calmly, his voice low but firm. She is remembering the future, just as she remembered her voice. What you see as impossible, she sees as inevitable. Victor's chest tightened. His daughter hadn't just been healed, she had been changed, awakened into something beyond comprehension. And as her speech grew stronger, so too did the weight of the truths she carried. The boardroom of Aldridge Enterprises was not accustomed to silence. Normally, it pulsed with arguments, deals, and the thunder of men and women who moved empires with their signatures. But on that morning, when Eleanor entered with her father, the atmosphere shifted into an uncanny stillness. She was pale but radiant, her voice strong enough now to carry across the entire length of the table. Victor had resisted bringing her here. He wanted her to remain at the hospital, away from prying eyes, but Eleanor had insisted. They need to hear, she told him, her gaze distant yet sharp, as if she saw more than the walls around her. Against his better judgment, Victor agreed. The executives rose to greet them, their surprise thinly veiled. They had seen Eleanor's silence splashed across tabloids. They did not expect her to walk into their sanctum with her head held high. Victor cleared his throat to speak, but Eleanor stepped forward before he could. The tower will not hold unless it is mended, she said, her voice clear, ringing through the marble room like a bell. Several board members frowned in confusion, while others exchanged wary glances. Only Victor understood the weight of her words. One of the younger executives chuckled nervously. With all due respect, Miss Aldridge, what tower are you speaking of? Our buildings are the strongest in the city. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. The one on East Riverfront. The one with glass that does not sleep. If you do not replace the foundation stone, it will collapse when the rains return. The room fell cold. Engineers in the company had discovered the flaw only days before, but the report had not been made public. Victor had buried the news to avoid panic. Now his daughter, who should not have known, had exposed the secret before the board. Gasps rippled through the room. Some accused her of being fed inside information, others whispered about leaks. But Eleanor was not finished. She spoke again, her voice carrying strange inflections, as though layered with echoes of countless others. And if you do not listen, the fall of stone will not be the only ruin. Your empire will follow. A heavy silence swallowed the boardroom. Victor's heart pounded as he realized the truth. His daughter was no longer simply healed. She was a seer, her voice carrying knowledge that bent the line between present and future. After the meeting, Victor pulled Thomas aside in a secluded hallway, his composure shattered. This power she has, it's dangerous. How do we control it? Thomas shook his head slowly. You do not control it. You guide it, or it will guide you. Her voice has returned not to please you, but to awaken the world around her. You asked for her speech. What you did not ask is what it would cost. Victor stared at him, trembling. For the first time, he wondered if he had made a mistake. His desperation to hear Eleanor speak again had opened a door, and he had no idea what was walking through it. The weeks that followed became a storm for Victor. Eleanor's voice no longer belonged only to him or the hospital. It had become a force that spread far beyond the walls of Aldridge Enterprises. News of her uncanny predictions leaked, first whispered by board members, then carried like wildfire into the public sphere. Reporters hounded the company day and night, demanding to see the girl who could speak the future. Investors, once panicked by the tower's fault, now clung desperately to her words, treating them as prophecy. Victor tried to shield her, to protect her from the frenzy, but Eleanor refused to remain silent again. She spoke at meetings, her words flowing with a calm certainty that bent hardened executives to her will. She warned of market crashes, of environmental disasters, of choices that would corrode the company from within. And every time her predictions came true, her power grew. Yet power was not what Eleanor sought. In quiet moments, she told her father, "I was never meant to stay silent, Father. My voice isn't just mine anymore. It carries something greater. Something I must give." Victor's heart ached. He had begged for her voice to return so he could have his daughter back, the laughter, the simple conversations, the closeness he had lost. But what came back was larger than what he had asked for, and it was no longer his alone. She was no longer just his daughter, she was becoming something the world demanded. One night, after a long day of speaking to crowds that gathered outside the corporate towers, Eleanor found Thomas waiting in the lobby. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "You gave me my voice," she said. "But it wasn't just to speak, it was to awaken." Thomas nodded, his expression both proud and weary. "Voices like yours don't come without cost. You must choose how much of yourself you give to them." Eleanor turned toward the glass walls, the city lights glittering beyond. "Then I will give everything," she whispered. Victor watched her, torn between pride and despair, knowing he could not hold her back. The girl he had fought so desperately to save was no longer his alone. She now belonged to the world, and the world would never be the same. The night of Eleanor's final speech arrived without fanfare, yet the air in the city felt charged, as though the streets themselves knew something extraordinary was about to happen. The plaza outside Aldridge Tower swelled with people, investors, journalists, skeptics, believers, and ordinary citizens who had come because word of the girl who speaks truth had reached them like a call. Victor stood on the stage beside his daughter, his chest heavy with pride and dread. The CEO who once measured life in profits and losses now measured it in moments of fragile humanity. He remembered the silence of her hospital room, the tearful plea he had made, "If you teach her to speak again, I'll give you everything," and how Thomas, the man everyone overlooked, had answered with quiet certainty. Now here they were, and everything truly had been given. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice carrying with clarity into the restless crowd. "I was once silent," she began. "And in that silence, I thought I was broken. But silence was a doorway. It taught me that our voices are not ours alone. They carry the weight of those who came before and the promise of those yet to come." She spoke not of towers or markets this time, but of compassion, of responsibility, of choosing to build a world where strength came not from wealth but from listening. As her words flowed, the crowd grew quiet, then still, as though each person was being spoken to individually. Victor's throat tightened. He realized then that this was no prophecy, no prediction of disaster or fortune. This was a farewell. Eleanor's voice trembled, not with weakness but with finality. "A voice is a gift. Use it not to silence others, but to lift them. Use it not to hoard power, but to share hope. My voice has returned to give you this, and now it will rest." And as she finished, an uncanny hush fell over the plaza. Eleanor's lips closed, her eyes soft with peace. She turned to Victor, smiling as if to say, "You asked for my voice, and I gave it back. Now let it live beyond me." Thomas, standing in the shadows, gave a small nod, his part complete. The janitor who had healed her slipped quietly into the night, unseen by most, as the crowd erupted in reverent silence instead of applause. Victor held his daughter close, tears streaming freely. He had gained more than he ever dreamed, but also learned the deepest truth. A voice, once awakened, belonged not to one man, but to the world it touched. And in that truth, Eleanor's gift lived on.